Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive.
It's great to be back.
Today we're taking a deep dive into some really core ABA concepts: aversion, avoidance, and anxiety.
Oh, good ones.
Yeah, it seems like these are concepts that everyone in ABA is talking about these days. So we're going to crack open a classic behavioral text and really get to the bottom of what they mean, especially for you, the listener, and your work.
Sounds great. Yeah, I think they are foundational. And getting them right can make a big difference in how we understand and approach behavior.
Exactly. So we're not just going for like textbook definitions here.
Right.
We want to see how these ideas play out in real life and give you some practical takeaways that you can use right away in your practice.
Absolutely.
So first up, what does it really mean for something to be aversive? I mean, is it as simple as it sounds?
You know, it's interesting. When we say aversive, we're not actually talking about whether something feels bad or unpleasant. It's more about how it functions in relation to behavior.
So it's not about me saying, I hate, Brussels sprouts.
Right.
It's more about like what happens because of them.
Exactly. Think of it this way. If taking something away reinforces a behavior, meaning it makes that behavior more likely to happen again, then that something was likely aversive.
Okay.
It's like negative reinforcement in action.
So like a super loud noise, like a fire alarm going off. Most people want to get away from that sound.
Perfect example. And see, escaping that blaring alarm reinforces whatever you did to escape it, like covering your ears or leaving the room. And what's really interesting is even things that we usually like can become aversive, depending on the context.
Okay, wait. How could something good be aversive? I don't get that.
Well, think about it this way. You might love listening to your favorite song, but if you had to hear it on repeat for 24 hours straight,
Oh, yeah. No, I'd be done.
you'd probably be ready to rip your ears off.
Yeah. Okay, I see what you mean.
Too much of a good thing.
Too much of a good thing can become aversive.
Exactly. So aversion isn't about some inherent quality of a thing,
Yeah.
It's about the functional relationship between that thing and the behavior it produces.
That makes a lot of sense. So how does this all connect to the idea of escape behavior? I mean, they seem kind of similar, right?
Yeah, they do. Escape behavior is all about actions that directly reduce or remove an aversive stimulus that's already happening. So think about it as like getting away from something you really don't want to experience.
So like going back to the fire alarm, covering your ears or leaving the room, those would be escape behaviors.
Spot on. And our text gives us some other good examples too. Turning off a blindingly bright light, moving away from a source of heat, or putting on those noise-canceling headphones to block out distractions.
Yeah, those all make sense. It's like we're programmed to get away from stuff that is unpleasant or uncomfortable.
And from a behavioral standpoint, this is all about negative reinforcement strengthening that escape behavior. The more successful we are at escaping something aversive, the more likely we are to repeat that escape behavior in the future.
Which makes me wonder, how can we be sure that a behavior is truly escape maintained? What if it looks like escape, but it's not? What if it's something else going on?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And that's where keen observation and a good functional assessment are really important.
Right.
Because sometimes what looks like escape, might actually be a way to get attention or to get access to something that the person wants. We can't just jump to conclusions.
Right. We've got to figure out what is actually reinforcing the behavior, not just what it looks like on the surface.
Right, because by understanding the function, we can develop more effective and targeted interventions.
Okay, that makes sense. So our text points out something pretty interesting about aversive stimuli,
Okay.
and that is that they're often used because they get, pretty quick results.
That's true. Yeah, you see an immediate change in behavior when an aversive stimulus is presented. But there's always a but, right?
Right.
Using aversives can have some unintended side effects.
Okay.
They often trigger reflexes and emotional responses that can complicate things
Okay.
and make it hard to understand what's really going on.
Oh, so this is where I got a little confused. The text brings up the example of hunger pangs, and I'm not sure why that's relevant here.
Oh, that's a great question. So that example highlights just how nuanced all this can get. We tend to think about drives like hunger as being unpleasant things we want to escape. But hunger pangs actually show us that it's not always so simple.
Okay.
Sometimes we eat to reduce those uncomfortable pangs.
Okay.
That's classic escape.
Right.
But sometimes we eat because we enjoy the food.
Yeah.
That's positive reinforcement. And often it's a mix of both.
So it's not always black and white.
Right.
There could be like multiple motivations at play.
Exactly. That's why it's important to consider all those possible factors, when we're analyzing behavior.
Okay, so we've talked about escape, but what about avoiding something before it even happens? That seems like a whole other, ball game.
It is. And to really understand avoidance, we need to add another piece to the puzzle, conditioned negative reinforcement.
Uh-oh. That sounds complicated.
No, it's not as complicated as it sounds. Think about this. Imagine the sound of a dentist's drill.
Oh, yeah. No, thank you.
But the sound itself doesn't hurt, right? It's the painful sensations that come after the sound that are aversive.
Right. So the sound is like a warning
A warning, yeah.
that something bad is coming.
And because of that pairing, the sound predicting the pain, the sound itself becomes a conditioned negative reinforcer.
So we start reacting to the sound like it is the painful thing, even though it's not.
Exactly. And that is the core of avoidance. We learn to avoid things that predict aversive consequences, even if those consequences haven't actually happened yet.
So like our brain is just trying to keep us safe, right, out of trouble.
Yeah, exactly. But here's a question. If we're always successful at avoiding something, shouldn't that avoidance behavior eventually just stop?
Well, yeah, I would think so. If the threat never happens, then we should realize it's not actually a big deal and stop trying to avoid it.
Right, it's logical.
Yeah.
But avoidance can actually create a bit of a cyclical trap.
Okay, now I'm really curious. Explain the trap.
Okay, so as we successfully avoid that aversive thing, right, the perceived threat, it kind of starts to fade away.
Makes sense.
And we might start to let our guard down and think, well, maybe it wasn't such a big deal after all.
We get a little too confident.
Exactly. And then, damn, we experience that negative consequence again.
Oh, no.
And that conditioned negative reinforcement comes roaring back.
Even stronger.
Even stronger than before.
So we avoid, the threat seems smaller, we test it out and get burned, and then we go right back to avoid it.
Precisely. It's a cycle that can be really hard to break.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of self-awareness and willingness to challenge those avoidance patterns.
And I think that's a really powerful point, especially for us in the ABA world, because it explains why some of those challenging behaviors that we see are so persistent.
Right.
It could be avoidance, but we haven't figured out yet what the person is actually avoiding.
We're missing a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why understanding avoidance is so important for effective intervention. Okay, this is all making so much more sense now. Let's move on to the big one. Anxiety. This is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean from like a behavioral perspective?
Well, in ABA, we don't view anxiety simply as a feeling. It's more like a whole behavior pattern.
Okay.
That includes those avoidance responses we were just talking about, plus all those intense emotional reactions we see when someone is facing a potential threat.
So it's not just feeling anxious, it's the whole package.
Right, like our text uses this example of somebody being robbed. It's not just about handing over your wallet, right? There's a whole cascade of changes that happen.
Emotionally and behaviorally.
Yeah, like your heart starts racing, you might freeze up, you can't think straight, your palms get sweaty.
Yeah.
That's all part of the anxiety response. And this is so important for us as ABA professionals because, anxiety is often a part of the picture for the people that we're working with.
It's not something that we can just ignore, right? It's part of the whole person.
Exactly. So by understanding the behavioral components of anxiety, we can be much more effective in the interventions that we choose.
Okay, now our text throws in a bit of a curveball here. It says that anxiety often seems to have, get this, no useful purpose.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because while avoidance, as we talked about, is often really helpful, it keeps us safe. The intense, emotional part of anxiety that can actually be very disruptive.
Almost like it backfires on us.
Exactly, because it can interfere with our thinking, our decision-making, and even our ability to do things that would actually be helpful.
So we need to be careful then as ABA professionals that we're not accidentally making someone's anxiety worse with our interventions.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of that risk and try to minimize it as much as possible.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground.
I know, right?
We talked about aversion, escape, avoidance, and anxiety. But before we wrap things up, I want to touch on one more thing.
Okay.
What about the times when, like, a stimulus actually predicts that something good is about to happen?
Yeah, it's like the opposite of anxiety.
Right.
Instead of bracing ourselves for something bad, we are anticipating something rewarding.
Yeah, and that anticipation, can lead to changes in our behavior, too.
Absolutely. Think about things like checking the mailbox over and over when you're waiting for a special delivery, or, that excitement you feel before a vacation, all those things.
Oh, or even, your mouth watering when you smell your favorite food cooking.
Exactly. Those behaviors are all maintained by the anticipation of something good.
So by recognizing those patterns, it can help us understand behaviors that might otherwise seem kind of puzzling.
You got it. It's all about connecting those dots and understanding the function of the behavior.
And I think that's such an important point because we can't really separate ourselves as practitioners from the principles we're using.
Yeah.
We're all playing by the same rules of learning in a way.
Absolutely. And that's part of what makes this all so fascinating, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about techniques.
Yeah.
It's really about understanding what makes us tiff.
Okay, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about interventions potentially causing anxiety. I know this is a concern for a lot of ADA practitioners.
Right.
How do we find that balance between, creating meaningful behavior change, but not making someone's anxiety worse in the process.
It's a delicate balance for sure.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of, I think, just careful thought and intention. We need to be very aware of those potential downsides and then just try to, minimize those risks.
So it's not just about like picking the right intervention. It's about delivering it in a way that's sensitive and that minimizes distress.
Exactly. We need to be mindful of the individual's history and their current emotional state and just their overall, well-being.
And that might mean like changing our approach as we go, right? Being flexible.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can't just stick to a plan if it's clearly causing too much stress. We got to be willing to adapt.
Yeah, makes sense. And that brings up something else that our text cautions against, and that is overusing aversive stimuli.
Yeah.
Even though, they might seem like the fastest way to change a behavior.
Right. And there's a good reason for that caution because while aversives might produce quick results, they can also have a cost.
What kind of cost?
Well, the cost of potential emotional fallout, things like increased anxiety, fear, even aggression.
Oh, wow.
And those side effects, those can be hard to reverse.
Yeah, it's like short-term gain, long-term pain. You see the behavior change quickly, but then you risk creating all these other problems.
Exactly. And that's why, it's crucial to explore every other option before even considering an aversive intervention. We need to be looking at reinforcement strategies, environmental modifications, skill building, all these things that can support positive change.
And I think it's important to remember that what's aversive for one person might not be aversive for another.
Oh, absolutely.
We can't make assumptions.
No one-size-fits-all approach here.
Right. Which brings us back to functional assessment,
Yeah.
right? You've got to understand the why behind the behavior before you can really do anything about it.
Exactly. Functional assessment, it's the bedrock of good ABA practice.
Yeah.
Because it's how we figure out what's driving that behavior, what those reinforcers are, both the positive and the negative ones.
And then we can design those really effective interventions that actually meet the person's needs.
Right.
Now, I want to go back to something we were talking about earlier, something that's often tied to anxiety, and that's avoidance.
Okay.
Our text really emphasized that cyclical nature of avoidance.
It's a trap, isn't it?
Yeah.
Both our clients and us, we can get caught in it.
And it all comes back to that idea of conditioned negative reinforcement, right?
Absolutely. We learn to avoid the things that predict those bad consequences, right?
Yeah.
And then when we're successful and we avoid those things, that perceived threat, it starts to fade.
Right, because if you're always avoiding something and never experiencing that consequence, it makes sense to start thinking maybe it wasn't that big of a deal after all.
Exactly. But here's the thing. As that perceived threat weakens, we might start to let our guard down. We might engage in that behavior again, thinking we're safe.
And
then, bam, we experience that negative consequence again.
oh no.
And that conditioned negative reinforcement, it rues back stronger than ever.
So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. We avoid, the threat seems weaker, we test it out, we get burned, we're right back where we started.
You got it. It's a cycle that is really hard to break.
It is, and I think this is an important takeaway for ABA professionals because we need to be aware of our own tendencies toward avoidance, how that might be impacting our work.
Absolutely. We're human, right? We're subject to these same learning processes. So by understanding how avoidance works, we can be more effective clinicians and more compassionate people, I think.
So for our listeners out there, what are some key takeaways they can use from this conversation? What can they actually do differently in their practice?
I think the first thing to remember is that behavior is lawful. There's a reason for every behavior.
Right. And our job is to figure out what that reason is.
Exactly. It's not enough to just label something, challenging behavior, bad behavior. We've got to do the work, the detective work. We need to understand that function.
Absolutely. And once you understand the function, then you can start to design interventions that actually make sense.
Exactly.
Another big takeaway is that, be mindful of unintentionally creating anxiety.
Yes.
We've got to be intentional.
Yeah.
And try to minimize the use of those aversive stimuli.
Right. Which means reinforcement-based strategies should be our space choice whenever possible.
Absolutely. And I think that takes, a little creativity, thinking outside the box.
Yeah.
It's not always about following a rigid plan.
Right. You got to be flexible, adapt to the person's needs.
Exactly. And I think another important point is that we're not just working with behaviors.
No.
We're working with people.
Right. It's about relationships and trust.
Yeah, creating an environment where people feel safe and supported.
Absolutely. And that's what makes ABA so much more than just a set of techniques,
Yeah.
It's about empowering people.
I love that. Okay, before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a question to think about.
Okay, I like it. Food for thought.
Yeah. So if anxiety is so often a byproduct of our learning history, all those pairings between neutral stimuli and those bad consequences. How can we, as ABA professionals, create learning environments that minimize unnecessary anxiety while still achieving meaningful behavior change?
Wow, that's a powerful question.
It is.
It challenges us to think about the impact we have on the people we work with.
And I think it's a reminder that we have a responsibility to be ethical and compassionate.
Absolutely. Always striving to do what's best for the people we serve.
To find that balance between growth and change, but without causing unnecessary fear.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance, but it's so important.
Yeah, it really is. I think it gets at what it means to be good at what we do.
Absolutely. It's about always learning, always, getting better and better at understanding behavior and just approaching everything with humility.
Well, I think it's safe to say we really did take a deep dive into aversion and avoidance and anxiety today.
We covered a lot, yeah.
A huge thank you to you for sharing all your knowledge. Always so great to chat with you.
Always fun to be here.
And to everyone listening, I hope this deep dive has given you some new ways to think about these core concepts.
Yeah, I hope so too. And some practical things to try out in your work.
These aren't just ideas, right? This stuff is real. Aversion, avoidance, anxiety, it's all at play in our clients' lives.
And in ours too, right?
And in our own lives,
Yeah.
Absolutely. So by really understanding how these things work, we can all be more effective.
More compassionate.
Yeah, more compassionate.
And really just create a world that's less anxiety-provoking for everyone.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you again for joining us.
See you next time.
And don't forget to subscribe and share this episode with your colleagues. We'll see you next time.